Be the right club. Be the right club today. Yes!
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Be the Right Club Today podcast. Al, what's up?
Not much. What a Masters, you know. I was pretty impressed with that.
Yeah, what'd you think? What was your how did you feel through like 2 or 3 holes?
Well, I thought we were going to have a pretty a horse race there after 2 or 3 holes, but when the turning point was when Scheffler chipped in on 3 and Cam didn't get it up and down. That was, I mean, I've been there before. That's the hardest shot on that golf course. And, you know, I think Scheffler chipped it, pitched it as well as anybody I've ever seen chip it and pitch it. You know, a lot of people that had, if they had hit it where he was hitting it, they wouldn't have got a lot of those up and down. And the reason why he won that golf tournament like that is because of his short game. So
yeah, I mean, the chip on 3 was obviously a little lucky. That thing was motoring and would have been, 8 to 10 feet easy, right? He'd have had a tough little comebacker. But like the chip on 4, he hits it long left and chips it up to a foot. How about what was it, 11?
How about number 1?
Yeah. How about 1?
How about number 1 right off the bat?
Yeah, a dicey little chip that he hit. I forgot about 1. And then I just remember 11. He hits it right on 11, and Cam hits it in there close. I'm like, man, birdie bogey, here we go. You know, I wanted Scheffler to win, but I think everybody was rooting for a tight finish, right? Just some drama. What do you think of our guest this week? We had Scott Cowx on this week, and this was one of the things we talked about. What did you think about the shot on 12 for Cam?
I just think you made a bad golf swing. You know, I don't, that's a tough place to be. Everybody can second guess that position, but man, I got to tell you something. That's the diciest shot in golf right there. You never know what the wind is doing. You don't ever stand over that shot with full commitment. There's always a little bit of a second guess on what you need to do there. And he was probably trying to do something a little different than just a stock shot. Yeah. And he mishit it. And he said so himself, and hard shot, really hard shot.
Thoughts on Tiger?
I know Tiger was disappointed, but I tell you, I think it's pretty awesome that he was able to make the cut, being like 11th or 12th place or whatever he was in, 19th. I can't remember exactly, but going into the Saturday and Sunday, it's tough. That's the hilliest golf course that they play. He's been hurt. He's not 100%, and awkward lies. And I think we haven't heard the last of Tiger Woods. That's what I think.
It's good to know that he's already committed to playing the British Open, and he said he was going to try and play at Southern Hills at the PGA. So it's he hit a lot of really good shots. He's swinging at it pretty well. He hit a great shot on 10 one of the days. Like he just some high quality, high caliber. He even drove it pretty well the last couple of days. The putter kind of left him. I think he made all of his putts on Thursday. But It's just so good to see him back out and playing again.
Well, he hit some great pitches himself too. And, that was kind of good to see. That's a tough golf course to bottom out correctly all the time. And it looked like he was doing a pretty good job of that most of the time. So that tells me that he's doing a lot of things right.
Yeah. So, getting into our guest this week, had a good friend and, kind of been a mentor of mine, really good golf coach, really good golf instructor, Scott Cowx from up in Canada. Scott was the 2019 Canada Teacher of the Year, National Teacher of the Year up in Canada. He is a consultant for a lot of instructors around the world. He does a program called the Scott Cowx Certified that I've done a few of his classes, and he's one of the brightest minds in golf. And it's always awesome to sit down. How you've had a couple of conversations with him too. He's a very, very bright mind.
He is, and I had a scheduling conflict and wasn't able to be part of it, but sure wished I could have been because each time I've had a conversation with him, I was always impressed with how he broke down the golf swing. So,
yeah, we had some questions lined up for him, and it was a really great interview. And you guys enjoy Scott Cowx. Hey, Scott, thanks for joining us. We've had a lot of great conversations. You've helped me with a bunch of my players, and been a mentor and a friend for a while now. And thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Obviously, it's great to talk to you and Hal, and love the work you're doing in Houston for sure.
Awesome. So give our listeners a little bit of a quick rundown about you.
Well, basically, I've been a PGA of Canada member now for 28 years. My specialty is bringing biomechanics and geometry together, basically, and understanding human anatomy a little bit, and understanding how the joints work and how we can utilize those to make better golf swings. And from there, I've been blessed to work with all levels of players, including major champions, as well as PGA Tour players and regular folks as well. So it's a real broad spectrum. I enjoy helping players obviously enjoy the game a little bit better.
Yeah, I've done 4 or 5 of your seminars. You do a lot of coach to coach seminars where you help us teach better. And I've been fortunate to sit in on 4 or 5 of your seminars now, and love the work you do. And we'll definitely get into a little bit more of that stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the Masters, and specifically, I want your opinion on Mr. Scottie Scheffler, winner of 4 of his last 6 events. And you mentioned biomechanics, and you mentioned a little bit of ground force stuff and whatnot. What do you think of Scottie's footwork?
I love it. I mean, it's a throwback. I mean, it's Greg Norman all wrapped up again into 2022 version. Greg Norman was the longest, straightest driver of his generation, and Scottie's very, very accurate for as far as he hits it. He's sitting up around 180 ball speed, but he's last time I checked, somewhere around almost 70% of his fairways. So he's incredibly accurate with that golf swing. Obviously, great putter. Ted Scott in the bag, I think, has been a great addition. Teddy's a great caddy and has got some great ability, I think, to keep his players kind of in the moment. And kudos certainly to Ted for the great work he's done with both Bubba and now Scottie Scheffler. But yeah, a lot of kind of Nicholas Norman kind of movements there in the lower body. We see. Say Greg Norman does that. A good buddy of mine, Grant Waite, does that a little bit on the driver. A little bit of a toe drag or bowling move or whatever you want to call it there kind of keeps the body in its tilts a little bit better. That's kind of what it does, is when that foot kind of kicks behind you like that, it keeps the body in side bend a little bit easier. So that's kind of the mechanism. Obviously, it's probably something that he's not even conscious that he does. I wouldn't say it's been put in there on purpose. But there is some functionality to it. And when we see players like a Greg Norman back in the day, you study those swings, you saw the same kind of movements.
When you see a student, he worked with he's been coached by a friend of mine for a while, Randy Smith. I worked with Randy when I was just out of college, or just in college, I say. When do you decide when to tweak that, when to clean it up and when not to clean it up? Is it based off the results? Meaning, if he's good enough, do you leave it alone? You like to say, he's a Ferrari, or, he's, if they're at a certain level, you're going to obviously teach them a little bit different. But how do you go about deciding when to clean up his footwork or when to let him be him?
Absolutely great question. I think ability trumps everything. I mean, if he can obviously flat out play, which he's done since he was a junior golfer in the Dallas area. I can't remember the stat. It was staggering, something like 120 or something junior events or whatever the number. But he's obviously been a very high achiever from a very early age. So I think that you can kind of look past that, and certainly kudos to Randy Smith and other coaches who would leave that stuff alone and say, listen, we're gonna change the things that we need to change, but we're gonna leave the things that don't need to be changed alone. And I think that's a great viewpoint, and certainly something I try and do with most of my players is try and be as minimalistic as possible. I'm going to try and move you in the right direction with as least amount of change as I can give you. Sometimes, obviously, change has to occur. Now, if he wasn't striking the ball like Scottie Scheffler can actually strike it, then obviously that might be a different scenario. But in this case, I think it certainly helps his model, if you will, which is, again, a bit of a throwback. It's not as rotationary as a lot of the modern swings. It's more lateral, it's more upright. Again, kind of reminds me a lot of Greg Norman mid 80s kind of golf swing. So for those of you that aren't maybe familiar with Greg's swing, I mean, look up on YouTube, 1986 was the year that Greg could have won the Grand Slam. And I mean, that swing is not that far different than what Scottie Scheffler's doing now. So for some players, rotation isn't necessarily the answer.
When you say ability trumps everything, basically, would you agree with this statement? If there's less ability, then they've got to be better mechanically. If there's more ability, obviously you're going to let them get away with more.
Yeah, I think I look at good players, especially tour players, in three boxes. We've got technique box, we've got skill box, okay, or skill set box, and then we have the third box, which is skill sets under pressure, right? And to be a great tournament player and a great player in general, you need to have time spent in each one of those three boxes. So you could argue, about Scottie Scheffler's technique, and there's going to be some people that nitpick it and say it's not that great. Now, I would argue there's some really great things in there. But when you look at that middle box, which is the most important one, is skills, and his skill sets are incredible. He's a wonderful putter, obviously great short game. I mean, really, I think statistically, he's very high up in almost every single category right now on the PGA Tour. And then obviously the skill sets under pressure. It was only a matter of time till he probably got comfortable enough to now step through the door and win, and then win again, and then win again. And then now all of a sudden he's a major champion in the space of, what, 6 weeks or something, or 8 weeks. He's won 4 times or something. So really on fire for sure. It'll be fun to see if he kind of lasts for a while, maybe kind of stretches the streak out a little bit. But I think he's just a young guy who's realized how actually good he is, and maybe he sort of stepped through that door a little bit, and maybe the third box, the accessing those skill sets under pressure, is something that he's really obviously found in the last 2 months. Interesting to see the little the little pressure on 18 there. That was an interesting way to finish the tournament, but. As Max Homa tweeted out, he said, well, you might as well have tried to 6-putt it and win the Masters with a 6-putt, because that would be the ultimate flex. Yeah,
I love that. The ultimate flex is winning the Masters with a 6-putt on the last hole. I love that tweet. That was so good.
So it might be. I can't think of any other circumstance where somebody's won a tournament with a 4-putt on the last hole. So, anyways, kudos to him. What a great tournament, and I'm sure it won't be the last time we hear from him.
Sure. So I want to dive in a little bit more about your boxes. So we've got the technique box, we've got the skill set box, and then the skill set under pressure box. To me, the big question always becomes the skill set under pressure, because until you feel that you played at a high level, I played at a high level, Hal obviously played at a high level, but even we can't explain to our students what they're going to feel when they get in these situations. Like Randy Smith's worked with a bunch of great players, but he can't really explain to Scottie what he was going to feel coming down 18 or on hole 3 after he missed the green, and Cameron's just on a tear. And if Cameron hits that wedge shot to 3 or 4 feet, I mean, it is completely game on at that point. A couple of questions about the under pressure box. How do you handle when your players say their swing breaks down under pressure? Does that become then a technique issue? And then how do you try to help your players get through the struggle when if Scottie would have lost the tournament? How are you going to help Scottie get through that and be ready his next time out?
Yeah, great questions. Obviously every situation is a little bit differently, but I would say that in this day and age, the mistake I see a lot of players make is that when they do have a breakdown, or where they do, feel like their swing has failed them on the back nine of a tournament, the first thing that they do is they go and change the technique, which I think is an error.
So you're saying they're going to always blame technique, but it's not always technique.
Absolutely not. I mean, it's here they are. They can hit all the shots. They've got this, this great race car. It's powerful. They can do all sorts of different things with the golf ball when they want to. They've got this very strong skill set all the way through their game. There are no real weaknesses. And then all of a sudden it breaks down. Well, you could look at all sorts of different things. You could look at breathing patterns. You could look at nutrition. You could look at hydration. You could look at, obviously, the stress in the moment, all these different skills that players have to be able to access the skill sets that they already own. And, I love Freddie Couples gives a great example of this. And he says, anytime that he felt a lot of pressure, he would simply remember the very best shot he ever hit with that club in his hand. And he would think about, hey, I've got a 3-wood, and I remember this 3-wood I hit up and around a tree and hit it to 2 feet and made eagle on this par 5, is giving him some positive vibes going into the shot. So something as simple as that can be a huge catalyst in terms of turning the corner and being able to perform well. And that last box, that skill sets under pressure box, is no technique in that box at all. This is all about you as a player accessing what you already own. And some players just don't own a strong enough skill set. I mean, that's a fair statement as well. Some players aren't as good as they think they are, right? And they have to build better skill sets, which is fine. And that's why it's important that we have stats collection, that we can compare them, strokes gained, strokes lost, and all these different categories now with our college kids and our tour players. So we can really show them, hey, you think you're really good, but you're actually not very good in this particular category. We need to probably do some work in that area. But if all their skill sets are incredibly strong and they're not able to access those when the heat is on, that's a totally different box to check. I mean, it could be sports psychology, could be, I said, breathing patterns, physiological problems in terms of hydration and nutrition. All those things are factors that you have to work into the equation a little bit. Sometimes it's just, sabotaging self-doubt and having that self-doubt in there and being able to step through that. And I love Scottie Scheffler's line. He said, he cried like a baby on Sunday morning because he didn't know if he was going to be strong enough to walk through that door. What an absolutely brave, courageous thing to admit to the world by someone to say, hey, listen, I'm just like everybody else. I get nervous too. And, for him to admit that, I think was an incredibly, enlightening moment for the golf world. Everybody feels those things. And I would say this, the best players simply just deal with it a little bit better than others. And sometimes a little necky cut off the 18th hole is just to put it in play is the right shot. It's not always the high bomb that goes 330. Sometimes just squeezing something out there into play and knocking something on the front edge of the green and 2-putting. Sometimes that's the right thing to do. And so I think that's where a good caddy or good, let's say, strategy comes into play and saying, okay, what's the best way I can deal with this? Now, having, players that have gone through doubt, I usually find that the strongest players can kind of rebound. I remember very distinctly, Mackenzie Hughes was qualifying for the U.S. Open one year to play the one that was at Chambers Bay. And he played in the 2010 amateur at Chambers Bay and was really excited. He wanted to get back there and get into that field. And he was leading with 1 hole left. He was leading the qualifier for the 4 spots and double bogeyed the last hole. He hit the dead down the center of the fairway. It hit a sprinkler head in the fairway and kicked under a bush, and he lost the ball. And he got up there and he striped the next one down there, and he hit a 9-iron to 10 feet. And he had a 10-footer to basically make it in, and he had a 360-degree lip out, and ends up going from leading to now being out of. There were 3 guys or 4 guys or something tied 1 shot back, so he ended up missing this and not getting to that U.S. Open. And to his credit, he used that as a catalyst. He went on an absolute tear. He was playing the Canadian Tour at the time, went on an absolute tear the rest of the year, got his Korn Ferry card and went on and, obviously got to the PGA Tour. But I really look at that moment as a very moment you could kind of go backwards on, or a moment that you could use that as fuel to maybe drive things a little bit further. He knew he was good enough. He was in the right situation. Totally got a bad break on the 70 or on the 36th hole of the qualifier. And, just wasn't to be. So I think if you can take a shred of positivity out of the experience, obviously, if I'm putting myself into position to win the Masters and I don't do it, hey, you had to do a lot of things right to get into a position to be able to win the Masters. So, Cameron Smith obviously had some trouble on 12 and kind of took him out of the tournament. But, you look at how well he's played lately, how well he's played in 2022, how well he put himself into position to maybe have a chance of catching Scottie in the final round there. You can't really look at that and say, okay, well, yeah, that was a choke or a pressure. You just hit one bad shot at the wrong time, and we've all done that. It just happens to be on 12. There's no forgiveness in in that hole whatsoever. So,
For sure. Scott,
anyway.
One of the things you said you think players are always blaming technique too much, and honestly, like I've said this on here 100 times about me. That was always me. Every bad shot I hit growing up was always my golf swing, and so I ended up running to instructors and getting help, and it helped me, I think, become a better golf instructor because I figured out what works and what doesn't work. But it didn't help from a playing career standpoint. You mentioned Cam Smith, and I want to stick to this kind of under the pressure versus technique thing. So again, we've got the technique box, the skill set box, and then the skill set under pressure box. And the skill set to me is separate. Let's focus on technique and skill set under pressure a little bit, because I just kind of want to get your opinion on this. So let's use Cam Smith. So he's been the best player in the world for the past 7 or 8 months. Wins the FedEx Cup, and then wins 2 out of his 4 events. One of the things I'm interested in your take on is, he struggled on coming down the stretch of the Players. He had a couple of wayward tee shots. He snipe hooks it left on 16, and it kind of got funky there for a minute, and then he blows it right on 18, and then hits it in the water and got up and down. He's statistically one of the best wedge players in the world. He's statistically one of the best putters in the world, and he's like 150th, 140th in driving. You saw a little bit of that at Augusta, some snap hooks off the tee, some high rights, and then you also saw it in one of the FedEx events where him and Finau were in a playoff. I forget the course. 18's a tough hole. Finau hits it down the middle, and Cam blocks it way right. My question to you is, are there certain times where under the most pressure that the technique can break down? And the reason I'm using Cam as an example, if you really break down Cam's swing, as you have, as I have, as all the instructors listening have, he gets it a little across the line at the top, and he pulls down and steepens a little bit, and that's kind of a big no-no in modern instruction right now. And he kind of does that, and he gets away with it for the most part. But is there anything in your mind that says, as he gets under the most intense pressures, that swing can break down on him?
Yeah, I think one of the things I think that when we're designing golf swings for our tournament players, you want them to work better when the adrenaline is up, not worse. And that's one of the things where when you build a swing that may have a little bit more timing, his transition when he's driving it really well, and he's quite long. Like, people don't realize that he hits it 177, 180 ball speed. He's not a short hitter by any stretch. He's got a lot of speed, but it looked like, transitional tempo got a little quick at times. And that's where it starts to get a little wiggly across. And as soon as it does that, and he starts to get steeper around, early transition P4.5 on the way down, then he starts to shallow it super late. And at which point, the face is going to be wide open and coming from the inside, at which point, anybody's going to start to use their hands. And we saw obviously some left drives late in the day yesterday, I think on 17 as well as 14, right? Hit 2 pretty bad snap hooks at that point, but he's also prone to obviously a little bit of the right as well. So I think that, we all have tendencies. You want to understand those tendencies. And even with his iron game, he tends to get a little bit kicked across the line, but he's able to obviously deal with that largely most of the time if the transition is reasonably paced. I think when his adrenaline is up, he gets a little bit quick, probably. You're going to see a little bit steeper than normal, which is going to get him a little bit more under and open than normal, at which point he's got to react to that. So from a technique standpoint, I think without changing Cam Smith, you could probably, do some things to maybe allow him to be able to go hard at it without having to sort of transition quite the same way. That would be an area that I would maybe investigate as a coach and say, these are the kind of things that we see under the deepest pressure. Maybe there's something we can do from a technique standpoint to maybe bulletproof this a little bit. Whereas a player, for example, like a John Rahm, for example, like the harder he swings, generally the better he swings, and transitionally, when you put that left wrist into a bowed position like that, you start to press against it. And the harder you do it, there's some limitations that are built into the wrist joint based on what he's doing with that. Yep. For Cam, that's across and a little bit extended, there's much more range in the wrist. And as a result, I think there's more randomness, if you will, in terms of the position of that wrist. Versus, let's say, a John Rahm or even a DJ to a certain extent. Right. So that's where it's interesting from an anatomical standpoint that you can kind of create some end range of motion joint restrictions, okay, is what I would call that. I mean, Bryson's big on some of that, creating some different ranges there to maybe lock out a certain movement or lock out a certain direction of the momentum of the club head. And that's we all have to fight is inertia and centrifugal force of the club. It's whipping around up there, and we've got to have a sensible way of not only capturing that and maybe redirecting that in a good way, but also be able to do it in a very similar way each time, because that's going to set up the timing on the face, the timing on the path to face relationship. So anytime that thing starts to dance around a little bit more, I think it becomes a little bit more, well, certainly a lot more difficult to figure out what's going to happen at the bottom.
Such a fine line too, with as much success as he's had, and you know, but I look at like the shot he hit on 12. Obviously, he hit a bad 9-iron. He's not the only one that's hit it in the water there, but like as good as he was swinging at it and then blocking it right like that, and then out of nowhere, especially after birdie in 11, you know, and then it, you know, my golf swing mind says that motion is going to cause him problems at times, and you know, he can always say that was just a bad shot, and we can leave it at that because he's had so much success. But that's where it's such a fine line between making him change it because of some struggles on Sunday at Augusta versus letting him be him and just keep going, and he'll deal with the consequences.
Yeah, and obviously that's like Phil Mickelson, right? Phil, to a certain extent, really hasn't changed anything in 30 years. I mean, minorly perhaps, but I mean, you look at his swings from when he turned pro as an amateur, or just after his amateur career to now. I mean, certainly his body's changed, he's gotten older and everything else, but the swing DNA really hasn't changed. And, you know, he's obviously won 45 times or whatever it is on tour with that golf swing. And he's failed miserably at times, you know, in the US Open and other times where he's hit just an absolutely off the wall shot and hasn't really tried to change it. You know, he kind of relies on his hands, and, you know, that might be Cam a little bit too. It's just like, hey, if he keeps putting himself into position, he's going to win enough of these events and shoot 34 under or whatever at Kapalua, and he's going to have good weeks like that. Obviously, Kapalua's got 65-yard wide fairways everywhere that, you know, being a little bit wayward with the driver probably isn't costing you much at a course like Kapalua. At Hilton Head, though, that might not work so well.
Yeah. Well, it's tough. It's such a fine line. You open up the door for a perfect little segue. I've got my next question to you is what would be 2 or 3 things, or the 2 or 3 biggest things that you wish every golfer should know, either about the golf swing, about golf in general? What would, if you could get on a big mega horn and you could broadcast to the world of golfers, what do you wish that golfers would know that they might not actually know?
Well, first and foremost is basic, just basic physics of how a golf club hits the ball in terms of being on an arc. Getting a low point, you know, hopefully past the golf ball on the majority of our shots that we play. I think those 2 things alone for the average golfer are very difficult to understand. Is they want to move the club in a straight line. They want to try and, you know, help the ball up into the air and scoop it up into the air. And to show them, you know, one of the drills I do with players is I'll take them about 2 feet from impact, and I'll tell them, I say, okay, show me where the club has to come from to hit a straight shot. And invariably, they all put the club directly behind the ball and they try and scrape a line through the ball in a straight line. I said, well, actually, no, it's actually coming from here. And I showed them this very, you know, quite dramatic arc into the back of the ball. And, you know, it blows their mind because it's like, wow, the club is really moving in to out at that point, 2 feet before the golf ball. I said, yes, but as your body rotates and the club continues to catch up to the handle, the whole apparatus is squaring off and reaching a very square condition at impact. And once we kind of show them that, this is where leverage comes from. This is where, you know, a lot of our speed and power comes from, is swinging this club on an arc and obviously with a low point that's out in front. So those would be the 2 most important pieces, is understand what the club needs to do. You know, from there, we can manipulate the anatomy in so many different ways to either help that or hurt that. And at that point, you start building your fundamentals around that principle. Understand what the club needs to do. And that's the one thing that all of us are bound by, is the laws of the golf club and the physics of the golf club. We have to use clubs that have a certain lie angle. It can't be 90 degrees like a croquet handle. It can't be a baseball bat swinging horizontally. It has to be on a diagonal plane. It's in the rules of golf. You know, there's limitations there in how flat and how upright you can go. So as a result, to a certain extent, we are all challenged with the same laws and the same rules to play this game. So we better understand maybe some of those things first. And then from there, we can fit the body, we can fit the anatomy into that situation by adjusting grips and setups and, all these different things to either make it easier, for the player to accomplish those things.
What 2 or 3 parts of, you mentioned anatomy a bunch, what 2 or 3 parts of the anatomy or even of moving the golf club around influences accuracy, and what 2 or 3 parts influence speed?
Nice. Well, accuracy, in terms of first of all, we better understand how the wrists need to be used. So we need to understand the grip that we're utilizing, and also how we're actually unloading the speed through the wrist. Are we releasing it towards supination and flexion, or are we moving it toward extension a little bit? Because those 2 different things are going to have two very different setups at address. Okay. In terms of the upper arm placement, the radial bone placements on each arm, all those things would be manipulated and changed based on how the player is using the club. Now, for most golfers, I would usually advocate sort of, let's say, our classic turn down, supination and flexion, because with that type of release style, there's less necessity on being able to turn and side bend rapidly, which is really the hallmark of your professional players, the ability to turn and side bend and tilt and extend and do all these things incredibly rapidly and match that up with the speed of the arms and the club. Most human beings can't do that. So as a result, we kind of get into the analogy that most golfers should play, kind of the tail wagging the dog. Let's control the club, let's control the wrists and the arms, and then fit the body movements to that, right? Now, that might not build the most powerful player. Okay, if I'm looking at those things, I'm looking at, the timing of our ground reaction forces. We start to develop speed from the ground first. We've got to be able to turn and rotate rapidly. We've got to be able to turn and extend and tilt and do all those different body things. So now we're building the dog wagging the tail, saying, okay, how do we build this really powerful car here? And then we'll fit the wrists and the club and the grip and all those things to the car, as opposed to the other way around. So I think there's a definite shift there at some point in development, where if you've got some promising juniors, like obviously you work with a lot of great college kids and pros and so on yourself, they're more in that latter category. They already have a pretty good car. We're just fine tuning the transmission a little bit, or fine tuning the steering a little bit every time they come see us. We're not necessarily rebuilding this whole car. For the amateur golfer, the club golfer, it's more about, let's improve the science of delivery. If we improve the science of delivery with that player, they're going to leave that lesson hitting the ball better than they came. They're going to go out and enjoy their game of golf better, but they're not going to be Ferraris, right? And that's okay. And that's okay. Now, if they've got the work ethic and the time and to spend on it, well, now we can have those conversations about how do we use our body maybe more efficiently to become a little bit more like the race car. So I think there's the viewpoints of the instructor has to really change based on the client that's obviously there in front of them, how much time they're willing to spend, how much, financially, how much money are they willing to spend on this project? All those things are going to factor into the game plan that we develop around them. But in terms of power production, some of the things I would look for, certainly ground reaction force stuff, doing a lot of research right now on hand speed. Okay, so about 10 years ago, I was doing some research for Zepp, who used to make a little sensor that went on your hand. It was measuring some hand speed. Now doing some work with DeWiz, who Bryson works with a little bit, and Vijay Singh and Henrik Stenson. It's a Swedish company. They basically got a watch that measures a whole bunch of things. It measures timing, measures hand speed, does some really interesting things. And there's some very direct correlations to how far you hit a golf ball and obviously what your maximum hand speed is. So, for example, on a 7-iron, the tour average is somewhere around 47 centimeters before impact is when your maximum hand speed. So basically 1.5 feet before impact, roughly P5.5, is where that hand speed should max out. If it happens later than that, you won't be able to translate that angular speed out to the golf club very well. If it happens too much earlier than that, then we start to have some overtaking problems where the wrists break into extension, et cetera. So not only are we creating this great hand speed, but it has to be well placed in a golf swing as well. And that's something that we see with amateur golfers. That's all over the place. So in the pros that we've tested with this, we see, when they're swinging well, it's less than 2 centimeters. It's very, very tightly the same timing, if you will, in terms of where their hand speed maxes out. When we start looking at the raw speeds, this is where it gets very interesting, because, you know, there's a correlation between the hand speed and the club speed of about somewhere with a 7-iron, it's about 4.6 to 1. Okay, with a driver, it's about 5.2 to 1 on average. There's players that are high end and low end, but basically, this gives us an idea of how a player creates their speed. Is a player using more of the angular components and dumping the wrist super hard at it, or are they developing it more holistically through the body and they're just generating more hand speed? So 19.5 miles an hour is around PGA Tour average hand speed on a 7-iron. That translates at 4.6 to 1, basically somewhere, let's say 93 to 94 miles an hour clubhead speed. Okay. Now, unequivocally, the cool part is if I go from 19.5 miles an hour to 20.5 miles an hour, I'm going to go up about 4.6 miles an hour in clubhead speed. So we get these massive jumps in clubhead speed, which is what I'm interested in as a coach, is how do you get a player from 90 miles an hour with the driver to 100 or 110 or whatever it happens to be. Well, you can't get 110 miles an hour if your hand speed is only 14 miles an hour. It's just physically impossible to do it. So that's where it gets very interesting when you start to tie the ground reaction forces into all this stuff, because by themselves, the ground reaction forces illuminate a lot of things. But if I can't translate that into my lead arm, it doesn't matter. Okay. Likewise, if I'm a strong enough, powerful person, I could just stand in a chair here and just hit balls with my arms here. If you could still create roughly 22 miles an hour, or 22 miles an hour would be about 120 mile an hour clubhead speed. Okay. All things considered equal. So you need the ingredients, right? It's just like making a cake. If I want 120 miles an hour, I can't do it with 16 miles an hour hand speed. Physically impossible. So
that's one thing. My background is in 3D. I did a lot of stuff with a company called My Swing, and
right.
was their director of education for a long time. And I tell students all the time now, I'm like, we had plenty of guys with fast hip, with high hip speed, high hip rotational speed, that were slow swingers. They didn't hit it very far. But I said we didn't have anybody that hit it a long way that had slow hand speed, slow lead arm speed. They all swing it really, really fast. What's interesting too is where, you know, in your research, and we saw something similar, but where the hands are slowing down at impact. They have to transfer the energy to the club. And I think a lot of our listeners at home wouldn't think that. They would think that, you know, the hands are still speeding up through the ball and all that, but that's not what's happening. In your research so far, if you've got a guy that's swinging at 100 and wants to swing it at 110, what are some of the things, just simple ways, like little drills or little thoughts or tricks or intentions that you would try to help him understand in order to get that 10 miles an hour gain of clubhead speed?
Yeah, and that's hard. I mean, basically, this is the reason why, you know, we look at the pure out science of this. Basically, for you to get 10% faster in speed, okay, so to go from 100 miles an hour to 110 miles an hour, you need somewhere around 29% more work. Okay, so it's not a linear progression where I get 10% faster, I put 10% more work in. It's no, I got to put 30% more work in to get 10%. So that's why everybody
how did you get that number?
So that's some of Sasha McKenzie's data stuff. So we start to look at, you know, basically 110 miles an hour is around 340 newtons of force into the handle. Okay, is kind of how much that takes, give or take. You know, you probably have, depending on how efficient you are with some of those things, you can probably move those around maybe by about 10 newtons, but that's about it. Okay. To get 120 miles an hour, you need roughly about 440 newtons of force put into the handle in the same time, right? Literally a quarter of a second. To swing at 150 miles an hour, these guys are putting somewhere around 700 to 725 newtons of force. So literally double what I would put into the handle to only get basically a 50% increase in speed. Okay. Or not even 40% increase in speed if I'm swinging around 110 miles an hour or so.
Got it.
So that's where it gets really interesting. So to answer your question, how does the average person get from 100 to 110? Well, first and foremost, you've got to plug up all the leakages. You've got to plug up all the things that are basically causing the energy that you do create maybe to be directed in the wrong direction. So truthfully, that's building a better swing. So just by getting mechanically better, often we can pump more energy into the system in an efficient way. So a lot of players already have enough energy. They're just putting it into the club very, very poorly, very haphazardly. Okay. So I would trim up those things first. That's worth a little bit of a gain. The second thing you want to do is definitely get the center of mass of the body involved. Have a little bit more pressure shift, have a little bit more center of mass rising and dropping in the swing, kind of like Rory McIlroy or Tiger Woods back in the day, had close to 9 centimeters of vertical drop in his belt buckle from the top of his golf swing down to P5. So that rapid dropping of the body, very aggressive dropping of the body, pumps a whole bunch of energy into the system, okay, that's basically free. You know, it's not a muscular thing. It's literally gravity. You dropping your body very suddenly is pumping a whole bunch of energy into the handle because you're holding on to it. So that's where players, you see a lot of LPGA players do that really well. You see long drive players, Jamie Sadlowski going up and down like a yo-yo. Obviously, Rory rises and drops quite a bit in his golf swing as well. And they're using that mechanism to pump as much as around 5 to 8 miles an hour is what my research says as in that one capacity has sort of unveiled that a lot of players can get 5 to 8 miles an hour faster just by having some rise and fall in their belt line or in their center of mass during the swing. Now, it has to be timed correctly. So we have to get the drop to happen basically right at P5 is where that maximal drop is going to hit. And that corresponds nicely to some of the research that Dr. Lin has been working on, which is the timing of the braking force and the vertical forces are exactly the same. And, you know, he finds that when you get those two things happening at exactly the same time, when the body's moving forward and down and they hit their peaks is right around that P5 location. If you're able to get the vertical and the horizontal to kind of be at that moment, that's kind of where the magic happens. That's where the timing, if you will, really improves and that player's speed goes dramatically up.
So as we're sliding slightly into the golf ball, our pelvis, our rib cage, our head's lowering down. The timing between the vertical and the horizontal force, we start to push up, and as we start to push up, we're also going to start to rotate a little bit more, and that helps transfer all the energy out to the club. Correct?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Transferring after that point, like you think of that as a staging rocket. You know, that early part of the downswing is the big rocket getting yourself off the planet Earth, right? There's a lot of work being done from the time you're basically backswing down to about P5 and a half. And around that time, you've got to transfer all this momentum that you've created, and you've got to transfer that momentum into angular output. And like you said, that's why we do see the lead arm drastically decelerate. And we're talking with the Wiz, we're seeing somewhere between a third to 50% of that lead arm speed is being cut from P5 and a half to impact. So it's a dramatic drop in hand speed there between that maximal placement and where it is at impact. And we need that to be able to give ourselves the time to be able to release that energy into the shaft and transfer the linear qualities of the swing into more angular qualities of the swing. And not necessarily that more is better. I think that each player, depending on your grip, depending on your shot shape, depending on your strength, is going to decelerate that at different amounts. And that's where it gets interesting with the timing of when that maximal hand speed occurs, because what we see on wedges, for example, is tour average around 42 centimeters. And it makes sense when you think about it, because by driving the handle speed later, you're creating more negative angle of attack. You're also creating, you've also got a shorter shaft to sort of get the club head to come around the corner. So I've got to move that maximal hand speed location a little bit closer to the golf ball on the short shots or on the wedges. The driver tends to be around 52 centimeters. So it's about 5 centimeters more than the 7-iron is. And again, makes sense. We're trying to line this thing up a little straighter up and down. There's less shaft lean. We're probably hitting up on it a little bit. All those different things are going to change the timing. So that's where it's quite interesting to not only look at what the max speeds are and how much you decelerate them, but also, at what time in the swing. And when we see inconsistent swings, we see those timings are all over the map.
Nope.
For sure.
Makes sense. All right, let's switch gears a little bit. For parents with kids at home, are you a fan of being an athlete or specializing early?
Definitely an athlete. I mean, here in Canada, we've got hockey and golf. That's kind of what we do here. And I think there's some great things that happen from cross training. Obviously, the weather in Canada, pretty much dictates that we do that. We've got maybe an 8-month season at the max, and at least 4 or 5 months off in the wintertime where you can't play. So as a result, a lot of Canadian kids are playing hockey and doing these things. I think from a golf standpoint, playing hockey, for example, builds a lot of lateral stabilizers in the hips and the glutes. So those things get really, really strong from skating. It's interesting talking to Dr. Lynn about some of the ground reaction force data that he gets from Canadians are more lateral, more horizontal. And a lot of that he thinks comes from playing hockey. Just naturally, we're wired to be a little bit more on the horizontal. Definitely my data suggests that as well. My verticals, my torque levels are okay. My verticals are pretty pitiful, at least without looking at them too deeply. And so different players, different countries, different areas in different countries, I think will produce different players based on their cross sports. But the other thing too is it gives kids a break. Gives kids a break from the competitive grind. I don't know how you guys do it all year round down there in Houston, where you've got tournaments literally 12 months a year if the kid wants to play. I think you get a lot of burnout at sometimes. Sometimes it's just nice to be able to hang it up and having that forced break. I mean, obviously right now, Masters is the start of golf in Canada every year. You get the Masters tournament, and usually the week after the courses are all starting to open. Everyone's excited, watching the Masters. We're all gung ho to play, hopefully the next 6 months of golf here. So it's a real rebirth every year, at least here in Canada with that. But I think it's important for for players to maybe do other sports, not maybe at a competitive level, especially if they're competitive players. But maybe they play recreational soccer. They play, they do some rec stuff. It doesn't always have to be, hey, I'm going to make my kid into a superstar. Have one sport they maybe specialize in later on. But I think in development, it's more important to do many sports. And having seen my daughters who are gymnasts and figure skaters, a lot of those skills, in terms of being able to use the ground and being able to obviously be very, very strong, it certainly helps your golf swings.
I completely agree with the burnout side of things, especially in traveling baseball down here, or like you said, golf all year round. It definitely becomes an issue. We've got to be very, very, very careful about that and convince parents to let their kids take a break. What age do you suggest starting kids playing golf?
Well, if they have fun with it, I've taught kids as young as 3. So, I think it's you just got to keep it fun. And up until I would say age 9 or 10, it wouldn't be much more than here's how you stand, here's what we're trying to do, and just go ahead and hit it. Figure it out yourself. Try not to really get a lot of instruction going early. Let them kind of figure out how to use their bodies, how they generate power, how they do some of these things instinctively and naturally, and watch them. And they'll give you a real hint maybe in the future, and when we can measure it on swing catalysts and some of these things, and this is how this player actually utilizes their body a little bit. I've seen some incredible swing catalyst data on some 9 and 10-year-olds that are off the charts in terms of verticals and things like that. Now, they look crazy when they do it with the golf swing because they weigh 60 pounds, right? But once they add some meat to that frame and they start pushing the ground the same way, a lot of these kids already know how instinctively to create this power. We don't have to teach them. So I think a lot of times it's the opposite. We end up teaching it out of them to make their swing look prettier, look more conforming. And I think at that age, we want to try and just make it as instinctive as possible. Now, once they hit maybe 11 years old, I think, okay, here's some more formal instruction. We've got, obviously some skills that we're trying to develop. Maybe a little bit more organization involved with it, but make it fun, get them hooked, have them enjoy the game, just as important as putting the ball in the hole is the milkshake they get after the round or whatever it happens to be, and keep the whole experience a lot of fun. So they want to go and play golf. They want to hang out at the golf course.
You talk a lot about the different technologies you use. What's your most important piece of tech? If you could take one with you and only teach with one for the rest of your life, which one would it be?
That's a tricky one. I think each one of them has their uses, obviously. But I would say, if I had a launch monitor to maybe monitor, exactly what the ball was doing, I think that's going to be helpful. Obviously, your eyes and things are very important as well. But I mean, just to be able to maybe dial in some things that would be very useful for sure. And then the second thing I would say is I want to understand maybe like hack motion. I want to understand what they're doing at the wrist level, or some basic 3D that I understand how they're delivering the club. And if I could get those two pieces, I can figure out the rest. It's one of those things where it's nice to have technology there to support your teaching and be able to, show people, hey, as we make these changes, this is what we're going to see in your TrackMan data, or this is how your 3D is going to change, or this is how your ground reaction forces are going to start to move, and be able to kind of predict what's going to happen, because that makes you a better instructor. That makes you, obviously understand your craft a lot better. And there's a little bit of a street magic kind of point there where they do see that value pop up and they're like, wow, this is crazy. He just totally predicted what was going to happen. And that's where you can use the technology to support what you're doing with your teachings, as opposed to, I think that sometimes instructors get lazy and they start looking at it and they just read off numbers all day. And it's kind of like, well, no, the machine's doing the work. You're not really thinking outside the box here in a critical way here. But yeah, those would be to the two pieces of technology, I would say. Something to verify what the ball's doing, something to verify maybe what's happening at the wrist level.
Would you take a lesson from an instructor who doesn't use any technology?
Absolutely. It depends on what they're bringing to the table. Somebody like let's say Lynn Marriott or Pia Nilsson, Butch Harmon, I would trust, certainly Butch has seen a lot of golf swings, a lot of great swings in his day. It's nice, obviously, to be able to verify it. If I'm the type of person that needs to have numbers, and support this with evidence, then maybe that wouldn't work. But there's a lot of great instructors, Chuck Cook, somebody like that. Absolutely. If I'm hitting a few balls, I'm gonna trust what he says and kind of work along those lines. And I think as a coach, it's important that the great coaches, I think, all have a certain eye. They can pick things up from 50 yards away. They don't need to have a piece of technology babysit them the whole time. But if I'm in Canada here, obviously a lot of our swing work is done in the wintertime. In a simulator, out in front of you, it's nice to have, some verifiable numbers to say, yes, this is what's happening.
What questions should students ask before taking lessons from a new instructor?
Yeah, I would say a couple things. First of all, a really clear-cut plan. That would be, are you going to create a game plan for me and some sort of a practice schedule for me that I know what to do after I leave this lesson? And I think that's important. I think we all need to do that. It's something that I've tried to do better in my career at times, been maybe a little bit lax on, is creating that sort of after the lesson value where it's like, okay, here's what I want you to work on. Here's roughly the drills you're going to work on each time you practice. We've got another lesson scheduled in 2 weeks. I want you to make sure that you get out 4 to 5 times between now and then, working on these drills, doing them this, specific amount of times, so that the next lesson we have together, we're going to see some progress. And because a lot of people just don't know, because they assume if they take a lesson, they're going to leave and that's all they ever need. They don't need to work on it. They got the lesson and they hit it better for 10 minutes at the end of the lesson. So that's the last thing they need to do. So I think it's teaching them, how involved and how difficult this game really is. And it is in constant flux and constant adjustment and constant evolvement. I think the best players understand that. They actually embrace that a little bit. They love the workload. They love to put in time and work on the range and do those things. So I think it's important to sort of instill that behavior or atmosphere, if you will, in your academy and say, yeah, we've got a bunch of workhorses. These kids hit balls all day. They practice, they chip and putt, they go play 9 holes and they do it again tomorrow. That's where you build champions for sure.
Any swing philosophy questions you'd ask?
I would want to know where they've come from.
Yeah.
I would want to know, who you take lessons from, who you follow on YouTube, who, who you like on Instagram, what swings do you like, etc., just to kind of get a little bit of an idea. Not that that's necessarily going to push them in that direction, but I want to know where they're coming from a little bit. So when we do have these conversations, we can either say, yeah, that's not for you. Physically, you're not built like DJ here. You're not going to be able to swing like DJ. So we might as well throw that one out the window. Let's maybe find a model that's a little bit more, similar to what you're doing.
But if from a student standpoint, if you were going to a new instructor, would you ask them any swing philosophy questions?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's valid. Just like if you go to the doctor, how are you going to treat me, doc? How are you going to do this? Are you going to electric shock me here, or like a slow Swedish massage? And it's going to feel good, right? I want to know before I go into this thing.
Oh, that's great. How often do you recommend? And this is kind of a tough question too. But how often do you recommend, or how often should people take lessons?
My personal guideline is I want them to practice somewhere between 3 to 6 times before I see them again. So for some of your students, that might only be a week. For some students, it might be a month. But I think they need to have enough time to take what you've given them, work their way through it a little bit, figure out the areas that they're struggling with, figure out the areas that they're doing well, and then come back to you with some feedback. If they haven't had enough time to do that, you're either going to give the same darn lesson again, okay, or they're going to have moved off into other tangents, right? If it's just too far apart. So usually I ask them that question exactly. I'll say, how long is it going to take for you to practice 3 to 6 times? And if they say a week, I'll say, okay, let's book something for the end of next week. If they say literally, I don't know when I'm going to get out to practice, it's like, okay, well, you know what, let's leave this open ended and we'll book something for 6 weeks from now and hopefully practicing.
Yeah. Amen. On that point, how do you recommend, how do we practice? What's your suggestions for how to practice, especially when we're making a change? And then the question we get all the time, how do I better take it from the range to the golf course, or from normal rounds to tournament play?
Yeah, exactly. And we're kind of flowing through the boxes again, right? So if I'm building technique, there's a certain mindset I need in that. I want to go to the far end of the range where there's nobody around. I'm going to set up my tools, set up my sticks, whatever I'm doing, whatever drills, swing aids, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to make my own little laboratory at the end of the range and put my earphones in and ignore the world and just work on stuff and whatever that happens to be. And at some point, though, we got to turn that off. And at a certain time in the practice, maybe it's that day, maybe it's the next day, I'm going to come back and I'm going to start hitting shots. I'm going to put a stick out there 5 yards from me. And I'm going to start hitting fades and draws around the stick. And I'm going to start playing golf on the range. And I'm going to start to be able to figure out what I did in the technique and build the skills that I need to go out and play. Right. And then the more I do that, then it's easier to take to the golf course, because now I have a target, now I have a start line, now I have a curve, all these different things I'm incorporating into my practice. So there's a definite layering that's going to happen from technique to skills on the golf course. And I think most players just don't do that. And that's why they can't take the swing, they get into a nice groove on the range, they're hitting it nice, and they get up on the first tee, and all of a sudden there's water on the right and out of bounds on the left. They're like, holy cow, there's actually a penalty here if I do something wrong. And obviously that wasn't what it felt like 10 minutes ago on the range, when the range was 300 yards wide and there was no repercussions to a poor shot. So you've got to practice with pressure as well. And I think that's important as well, is create tasks for yourself. And if you don't satisfy those tasks, do it again. I mean, that's what Tiger's practice sessions were way harder than any other round of golf that you'd ever play. I mean, to make 100 6-footers with his right hand only in a row. He misses one, he's got to start over again, right? Just some absolutely impossible Herculean sort of tasks here in practice, so that when he got to the golf course, it was pretty easy. He had 2 hands on it, and making a 6-footer wasn't a big deal. So make your practice hard. Stop practicing the club. Stop practicing with your 8-iron every day, and actually work on hitting a 4-iron, work on hitting a hybrid, work on hitting a 3-wood off the ground, because those are much harder clubs to hit. And if you can hit those off the ground really solidly and really well, then hitting an 8-iron is going to be an absolute breeze. So people like to practice what they're good at, not what they're not good at.
Yeah, there's so many great performers that have said make practice as hard as possible, so that way the competition's the easy part. Completely agree with that. Swing thoughts during a round. What's your take on swing thoughts?
I think for some players, and I'm certainly in this category, I probably need a feel. I need one thing at least, to sort of latch on to. I think the important thing in the lessons as instructors that goes along with this is one thing that I try and do in my lessons is outline concepts and keep them separate from swing thoughts. So I want the student to come into the lesson, understand conceptually what we're working on. Okay, so if somebody in the bar after the round says, "Hey, what are you working on with Scott?" they can clearly say, "Hey, I'm working on, making a better backswing or delivering the club a little bit differently from the inside," whatever it happens to be. That's the concept. Now, the swing thought could be a multitude of different things. And swing thoughts have an expiry date because they have to. Because the reason a swing thought works in the first place is because it's a weird enough feel that your body understands the difference between, let's say, right and wrong. But as I do that swing thought more and more and more, it becomes less weird. As a result, I don't know if it's working anymore. So that's why we have to discard that swing thought and maybe come up with a different swing thought. So swing thoughts definitely have a timeline, definitely can be thrown out, but most golfers that we work with confuse concept with swing thought. So now they're saying, well, I'm trying to put my right elbow in my pocket. And it's like, well, that one's not working anymore. Well, this whole swing thing doesn't work. So, what Scott's telling me must be wrong. And that player doesn't understand the difference between concept and swing thought. So
could I change swing thought for feel? Because Dr. Willwood talks about all the time, recalibrating your feels. Because I say that too, your swing thoughts are only going to work for a certain amount of time. You're going to have to recalibrate them. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. And the better you can put it into a feel, the better your right side of the brain can respond, which is really the performing side of your brain. So the more it's like riding a bicycle, right? There's a certain series of feels that you're doing to ride that bicycle down the street. Well, that's what your golf swing ideally should feel like, is just a series of feelings. Here's the feeling in my takeaway. Here's the feeling in the downswing. Here's the feeling post impact, whatever it happens to be that I'm working on. But that area and that feel is so important and so player dependent. And that's why the better the players that you work with, the more important is that we listen really, really, really clearly. And obviously you get to work with Hal all the time, but he's got feels that go back to the early 80s, when he was winning the PGA championship and so on, where he's got some very distinct feels that worked really, really well at a certain point in his career. And maybe there are feels that worked well at other points in his career. So we have to listen to those things, because sometimes they may not make any sense to us as coaches, but as a player, that makes total sense to Hal, or total sense to you, Chase, a certain feeling that you have in the swing. And those are the kind of the ones you write down in your little black book and you put 5 stars beside and said, this really worked well when I felt this. And
it's amazing too, with somebody like him, he's built up this motor pattern for so long over time that the feels could almost be completely opposite from one day to the next. His motion's not going to change that much. He's going to hit it great with both. And he's going to think that both of them fixed his swing. And he's not, I say he's the only one, but guys that have played at that level for so long, their motion's not going to change that much, and they can grab almost onto anything as long as it gets their mind focused on some task, and then they can just go perform.
100%. And sometimes if you're thinking about pink elephants and you're hitting it good, then keep thinking about pink elephants. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't need to make sense to anybody other than that player. And that's, I think, something that we have to be good communicators with our students to say, this is kind of what I want you to do. Here's what you're telling me. Here's the feedback I'm getting from you about what it feels like. I want you to key in on more what it feels like than what I'm saying, because the way I'm going to describe it and how it might feel to me is going to be completely different than how it feels to you. Mm-hmm. And it's not about me, it's about you. And so really understanding that. And I think sometimes, with our students, it's difficult because we're like, hey, this really felt great to me when I did it this way. And they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yep.
And we have to really work within their play box, if you will, or their sandbox, if you will, and sort of develop those feels together. And the better the player you work with is definitely way more collaborative, as you know, right? You're lobbing balls into their court, they're hitting them back at you, and then Yep. You're lobbing there and you're trying to see what sticks.
Yeah. I joke with my junior players. I'm like, look, if you haven't shot 65 yet, you can't argue with me yet. Like it's more me telling you what needs to happen. But once you shoot 65, now you can tell me what needs to happen. But you got to get to that point first. I'm like, once you become a superstar, then I'm going to shut up and listen to you. But until, I always kind of laugh about it. The other thing that I always try to tell people is when we're trying to make a move, like say change impact a little bit, I'll drill them to death until they give me the feel. And they're like, well, what's the feel? I'm like, no. You're going to have to tell me what you feel like once we get you in that position. I can't feel it for you. My body feels completely different than yours does. It's got to be your feel first. It cannot be mine.
Yeah, 100%. And that's the bridge we walk every day as coaches. It's just trying to find that fine line between concept and feel and reality. And how far do we have to push this player to get what we want out of them, to make the motor pattern change significant enough. We've also had they feel like they're doing something crazily. And as you said, with a guy like Hal, it might have moved a millimeter. Like literally it just doesn't move. He feels like he's moving a foot different because he's got such an ingrained motor pattern after playing this game for so long.
No, that's exactly right. Well, Scott, you've been awesome as always. Where can our listeners go to learn a little bit more about you or to contact you?
Best spot is usually my Instagram page at Scott Cowx Certified is the best place to find me. All my links and so on, my coursework, my certification stuff's all listed there. They contact me there for online lessons, etc., or consulting, coach consulting, and so on as well. So that's usually the best place to find me.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for everything you do for the game of golf and for instructors like me out there trying to get better. I've enjoyed our chats over the last couple of years, and you've helped me with kind of consulting with some of our students, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate you coming on the Be the Right Club Today podcast.
Well, I appreciate certainly the invitation, and we're all trying to get better. So I think that's I think golf's in a great place right now, industry wide. I think that we're sharing more. We're helping each other out and helping our students out immensely by being able to talk and chat and develop great relationships here. So that's one thing I think that COVID has really brought along is this willingness to share. And with Zoom and some of these powerful platforms like podcasts and so on, there's a lot of great information out there these days for players to latch onto.
Exactly right. Thank you, Scott. Really enjoyed it. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hal, what were your thoughts?
Well, I loved what he talked about Scheffler and Greg Norman. I noticed the exact same thing, the right foot, the way it was, in his downswing, it was going back behind him. Norman did the exact same thing. And the other comment that he made that was brilliant is ability trumps everything. And, as you know, if somebody comes into the academy here and they got a lot of ability, we say a little, not much. The less ability they have, the more aggressive we are.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? If Jim Furyk walks in here and Jim Furyk's a 15 handicap or not, he swings like Jim Furyk but doesn't play quite like Jim Furyk, we may go ahead and blow up the golf swing. But if he hits it like Jim Furyk does, then we're going to shut up and admire rather than start cutting everything. We talked a lot about, the three boxes that Scott talks about. His boxes are the technique box, the skill set box, and then the under pressure. It's basically the skill set under pressure box. To me, that's kind of fascinating, right? Like we talked in depth about it. One of the first box is how's your technique? And that's the box that we obviously take a look at the most, right? We can't, kind of hard to teach skill. Some people have it or they don't. We can help develop it a little bit, but it's hard to teach. And then the one that's impossible to teach is the skill set under pressure. Did you see that on tour? Did you see any guys that could hit any shot on the range, but then under pressure, they just didn't quite have it? I mean, is that a trait that you saw over the years out there?
I've been looking at that my whole life out of a lot of different people. And then you see the opposite of that. You see people that don't hit it all that good when they're playing, and then they rise to the occasion under pressure, and, what causes that? I have no idea what causes that. I mean, it may be will, just the will to hit the shot. It's amazing how some people rise to the occasion and others don't.
Yeah. And, Tiger was obviously the best I've ever seen at it. Did you feel like Jack was the same way?
In some ways, yes, but it just seemed like Jack stayed in position all the time.
Yeah.
And he was like a lion lurking in the bushes, basically. He was there all the time. And he didn't, I never did. Of course, I was later in his career, but he never seemed to just take control and take command. He was just around all the time.
One of the things that kind of I was interested in what Scott talked about. We talked a lot about, he's doing some research with a company and doing hand speed, and just this idea that, where do we max out hand speed, but also the fact that, and it's something we talk about in here all the time. You can't swing fast without fast hands. You can't swing fast without fast arms. And that's all the research that he's been doing, where, old school instruction for the longest time talked about, fast hips, and it was all with the body and all this stuff. But we're finding that that the arms and the hands obviously have to move fast in order to move the club fast. And then the last thing you talked about, which I thought was pretty interesting, and it's kind of similar to what you talked about, how with the under pressure stuff, was that, trying to make practice as difficult as we can, trying to add pressure to practice, so that way the game is more fun, that way the tournaments are more fun. Did you do any of that when you were younger? Did your dad ever make practice harder? Were you ever told to do that when you were growing up?
Not really. I was always trying hard shots when I would go out. I mean, I like practicing on the course. I was lucky. I grew up in an era where golf wasn't quite as popular. I grew up on a 9-hole course, and there wasn't a lot of people on the golf course all the time. So, And we had a 125-yard driving range with striped balls. So the best balls were in my bag. So I spent all the time on the golf course learning how to hit shots. And I practiced hard shots. Because I felt like it was more fun to pull off the hard shot. Yeah. So anyway.
Awesome. Well, as always, guys, thanks again for joining in. Scott's one of the best and brightest minds in golf, one of the best instructors in the world, and we hope you guys enjoyed him. And as always, thanks again, and we will see you next time.
Be the right club today. Yes!